The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Well, Trevor, I don't think our audience still knows what those signs of the times are. What do you think?
No, haven't even touched it yet.
Haven't even gotten there. We're supposed to be dealing with Matthew chapter 24.
Right.
We have dealt with the context quite
Right.
a bit.
Right.
We're going to continue there this evening as we started last week in dealing with Matthew chapter 24. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp, and we appreciate you watching our program. I'm the preacher at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ here in Mountain Home, and I have with us Trevor Campbell. And Trevor, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Trevor, and I'm also a preacher. I preach at the Payette Church of Christ, located in Payette.
Okay, and Trevor, would you tell them about getting in touch with you and the services at Payette, please?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, in Payette, we meet on Highway 62. We're right on the highway, next to the tractor dealership. We're on the north side there on the highway. And you'll see the meeting times posted there, 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings for Bible class and 10:45 for worship. And if you'd like to contact us, you can contact me at 870-435-2737. And that's a number also you can use to call if you have any questions to submit for this program. If you have a question about the Bible, we'll try to answer it with the Bible. Okay,
and of course, if you want to contact me, Keith Sharp, you can call me at 870-321-5746. What we do on this program is answer your questions from the Bible. And so let us know what your questions are, and we will give you a Bible answer for your questions. And so you can call me, or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Let us know what your question is. We'll be delighted to receive it, and we will not reveal your name on the air. You will remain anonymous. We invite you to the services of the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. We meet on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for Bible classes for all ages. We have our worship assembly at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and then we meet again at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. We also have a Wednesday evening assembly and Bible classes at 7 o'clock. We have a ladies' Bible class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and we have a men's class at 6:30 on Tuesday evening. We invite those to the appropriate services every time you can. Now, the Highway 5 South Church of Christ is 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass on Highway 5. As you're going south, it's on the left side of the road. That's the road that goes down to Calico Rock and to Mountain View. And so we invite you to come at the appropriate time and worship the Lord with us and study the Bible with us. All right, Trevor, we have the question before us to please explain Matthew 24. Of course, that's the famous passage that talks about the signs of the times. Now, before we go on with this, I want to mention something. There are people I know who are watching this program who have been taught things entirely different from what we're saying concerning Matthew chapter 24. And they probably haven't heard any mention whatsoever of the destruction of the Jewish nation that took place in AD 70. And there are other different approaches to the passage. We don't ask you to accept anything because we say so. Right. We want you to look in your own Bible and draw your own conclusions. We don't have, Trevor, does the Payette Church of Christ have a creed that people have to accept to be a part of that congregation?
No, absolutely not.
Well, how do you know what people are expected to believe?
We look at the Bible.
You just go to the Bible. Okay. Well, of course, we do the same thing at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. And we believe we can all come to a common understanding of the truth if we all study. It may take a long time. But if we'll all study the same book with the same attitude of faith and with an honest and open heart, we can do that. And we're all in a learning process. There are some things that we have to believe. I'm going to say this for a minute because we're going to get into some controversial things in Matthew chapter 24. There are some things that we have to believe in order to be saved. We have to believe that there's one true and living God. We have to believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We have to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. There are some things that we're expected to be one upon, we're expected to be united upon. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, there's one body and one Spirit, just as you're called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. That's Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. We are expected to be one, united upon those 7 things, the 7 planks of the Christian's platform of unity that the Apostle Paul lists there. Now, there are passages that we may disagree on. We give you the right to disagree with us, and we would like for you to give us the same right. But we all must stand before God to be judged by the things that we believe, that we practice in the light of what the Word of God says. Trevor may give an explanation of some of this that I disagree with, and I may give an explanation of some of this that he disagrees with. I give Trevor the right to state what he believes. He gives me the right to state what I believe, and we'll study with each other in a loving way, and we won't force our views on one another. Now, with that having been said, Trevor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, just like that. All right. All right, I'll take it. All right. The question is about Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to jump into there. Last week, if you watched the episode, and hopefully you did, because we talked about the context, and we studied a little bit of Matthew chapter 23, and we looked at some parables from chapter 21 and 22. And the reason we did that is we wanted to see what Jesus is focused on and what he's teaching about in his last days. Matthew 24 takes place during the last days of Jesus' life here on this earth. And it's actually a discussion he has on a mountain called Olivet. And he's there with just 4 of his apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And that's the 4 men who were present. And he has this discussion in Matthew 24 that's recorded for us. It's also recorded in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21 as well. And it's good to look at all 3 accounts, not just Matthew 24, because when you look at all 3, you're going to have a better understanding of what this is all about. If you just grab up Matthew 24, it can be a very difficult passage to understand.
Particularly if you don't take it in context.
Yeah, if you ignore the context, exactly. So, yeah, context is important, and we looked at those things last week. If you missed the episode last week, you can view it on YouTube. You can also view it on hometowntv.net. And can I view it on your Facebook?
On our Facebook page, Highway 5 South Church of Christ.
There you go. So you can kind of pick up and see what we've been talking about. But if you've been following along, that's what we were talking about and kind of looking at the context. There was one other passage that I wanted to look at just before we get into Matthew 24, and that's Luke chapter 21. And Luke chapter 21, I mentioned a moment ago, it's a parallel account. It's Luke's account of the things that took place on Mount Olivet when Jesus had this discussion with his apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And it's just a very simple verse. But in verse 22, Jesus says, "For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." And last week I didn't get to use that passage, and I wanted to, because this is a time of God taking vengeance upon his people. And that's what we're going to see in Matthew 24. It was a time in which God, the Son of God, had come to this earth. Of course, God had sent many prophets to his people, then they rejected those prophets. Now the Son of God has come, they reject him, they kill him. Well, now God is going to take vengeance. And he's going to also avenge the blood of those prophets that was shed. And he's going to avenge his elect, the Christians at that time, who were being persecuted by these Jews, who, when they rejected Jesus, furthermore, also rejected his apostles, his prophets of the first century, his teachers, the Christians in general. And they were persecuted very heavily. So this is a time of God taking vengeance. And so I wanted to kind of start that way before we jumped into Matthew 24 tonight. So Matthew chapter 24. If it's all right with Keith, I'd like to just begin reading the first few verses. And
sure.
Then we can kind of discuss it, and you can
You've got
jump
control
in
of
there.
The program, Trevor. It's all
yours.
yours.
Well, wait a second here. I don't want that much power. All right. Well, chapter 24 of Matthew. It says in verse 1, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" I'm going to pause just for a moment there. Herod's temple which Herod had, began the construction of this temple, Herod the Great, this temple was magnificent. In secular history, you can go in the history books and you can read about this temple. And it was unbelievable in its glory and its splendor and its wonder and the riches and the stones used and the gold that was used and so forth. It's a magnificent temple.
One of the wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So Jesus says here, not one stone is going to be left upon another. In other words, this is going to be destroyed, in short. That would be something that would get my attention. And I'm sure his apostles were kind of blown away, especially since in verse 1, his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And so you can kind of picture the scene. They're showing up, well, look at how beautiful this is, and look at these buildings and everything. And then Jesus says, well, it's all going to be destroyed. Whoa. Yeah. Well, when's that going to take place? That'd be what I'd want to know,
I would give an illustration of the impact, although this is an inadequate illustration. There was the magnificent Twin Towers in New York City.
Right.
They were the tallest buildings in Manhattan, which has more tall buildings in it than any other place in the world. And if somebody had said pre-2001 that these are going to be torn down, there's not going to be one particle of those buildings left. Somebody, well, you're insane. Well, that doesn't even compare with what the impact this would have on the Jews. For Jesus, the Son of God, to say, this building is going to be torn down so that not one stone is going to be left on another. Yeah. That would be having an enormous impact on them.
Yeah. I mean, this, after all, was the house of God.
Right.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, so Jesus says, not one stone will be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. In verse 3, now as they sat on the Mount of Olives, and that's the mountain called Olivet as well, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? All right, so they have some questions for Jesus here, and really it's two main questions. And I think it's important when looking at this and these questions to also consider the same account in Mark chapter 13, which records these same things, and also in Luke chapter 21. Now, in Mark 13 and in Luke 21, we're going to see the first question is almost identical in every single passage. Tell us, when will these things be? And that'd be a natural question you want to ask if someone said the temple is going to be destroyed. So they asked that. The second question here in Matthew is, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, what does that mean? Well, if we go over to Mark and Luke's account, and I'm going to go to Mark 13, because Mark and Luke are very, very similar. In Mark 13, in verse 4, the disciples, the apostles there, they say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? All right, so what's going to be the sign when this prophecy of the temple being destroyed, when is this going to be fulfilled? Another way of saying that is the way Matthew puts it, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, it's important to note that the word age there, I think it's translated in some translations as world or end of the world. It's not talking about the earth. That's not the Greek word used there. The age is a better translation. It's referring to an era of time, a period of time. So they're asking, what's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of this era? And what they're talking about is the time period that they're in currently, where God's nation is the Jews. As we looked at last week in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus had said that he was going to take the nation, or take the kingdom rather, from the Jews and give it to a nation bearing the fruits thereof. Well, that's the end of an era. I mean, for centuries now, God's people had been the Israelite nation. Well, that's not going to be the case anymore. Now God's people are going to be those who have faith in Jesus Christ, who heard the Son of God. So that's the end of an era and the end of an age there. So they want to know, when is this going to happen? What's going to be the signs leading up to this?
Okay. Before we leave that passage, Trevor, I want to give an alternate explanation for our audience to consider. And of course, you just think on your own and consider the reasons for both of these. In Matthew's record, that and of the end of the age is something that is not in Luke 21 or Mark 13, I believe.
Right.
And I do believe this ties in. I'm going to give another example of this phrase, the end of the age. Jesus uses it in Matthew chapter 13. which is the great chapter on parables. And in Matthew chapter 13, he's the parable of the tares of the field. And he says in verse 40, I'm going to begin. This is towards the end of his explanation of the parable of the tares of the field. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So there's another use by the Lord himself of that phrase, or actually the phrase, the end of this age. In this case, referring obviously, I believe, in context to the judgment, the final judgment at which those who are lost will be cast into hell. And in fact, that also ties in with the passage in Matthew chapter 23 when Jesus warned the Jewish leaders that by their rejection of the Son of God, not only were they sealing the fate of the Jewish nation, that it would be cast off as God's chosen people, and that it would be given to another nation. And by the way, that's a spiritual nation. I'll just throw that out at this time. We can talk more about that later, perhaps. But that the end of the age would be the same thing as the time when Jesus comes in judgment, not just on the Jewish nation, but on the world. Now, Trevor and I have a different approach, but I'm going to turn it back over to him in a minute, let him explain to you what he believes the proper approach is, and I'll make some comments as we go along. You come to your own conclusion. But I believe there's actually three questions he deals with in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. And the last of these questions, the end of the age, is the same thing he's talking about in the parable of the tares of the field in Matthew chapter 13. And that beginning in about verse 35 of Matthew, or verse 36, excuse me, that there he's talking about that third question, and he's leaving the question of the destruction of the Jewish nation and dealing with the end of the world, Jesus coming in judgment, and that leads into the parables of Matthew chapter 25. Now there's an alternate explanation, but I'm going to turn it back over to Trevor. But before we do that, Trevor, remind them of how to get in touch with you, please.
Yeah, you can telephone me. The number is 870-435-2737. It's on the screen there, and you also see the meeting times of where I preach and worship there in Payette.
Okay. And so be in touch with Trevor and let him know what your question is, or be in touch with me and let me know what your question is. And by the way, we're dealing with things in this program that are controversial. Things that Trevor and I don't see exactly alike as far as the entirety of Matthew chapter 24. And each of you has the right to come to your own conclusion. We're all going to individually stand before the Lord in judgment. And so you don't have to answer to me for what you believe. You don't have to answer to Trevor what you believe. You have to answer to the Lord, and Trevor and I have to do the same thing.
That's right.
And we grant each other the freedom to study the Bible for ourselves and come to our own conclusions, and we grant you that freedom. But please ask us the questions. As I said on last week's program, there's some things we have to believe in order to be saved. We have to be one on certain things. But we can discuss these passages and have an open and an honest attitude and disagree with each other and study with one another. So if you'd like to ask me a question, then you can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net. Or you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. All right, Trevor, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We have not quite 10 minutes left on the program, so you go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, back here in Matthew 24, regarding the questions here in verse 3, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I would like to look at two passages regarding the sign of your coming, and then also a couple of passages, I think, on the end of the age. But let's handle the first one first. What will be the sign of your coming? You know, what's interesting here is Jesus has already spoken of the fact that he's going to be coming back. In fact, in their generation, I think it's important to notice this. It's in Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16 is one of these places. Jesus talks about himself coming back, and he makes it very clear that he's going to come during that time period. In other words, during the first century, during the generation of these individuals that he's talking to. And remember, he's talking to 4 Jewish men, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, there in Matthew chapter 24. Well, in Matthew 16, and verse 27 and verse 28 as well, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." All right, now it's important to note here when Jesus talks about coming in his kingdom, he's not talking about the fact that they're going to see him receive the kingdom, although he would during their time period. That's not the reference he's making here. Notice he says, see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. In other words, kingdom having the power and the authority, being the king. And they would see him come. And what he's talking about here is the same thing he talks about in Matthew 24. And that is that he's going to come and visit them in judgment. Their king is going to visit in judgment. And of course, as we saw last week, he's going to destroy those wicked men miserably. It was the quote from the Pharisees and scribes. So that's one verse I wanted to look at regarding his coming. Another verse is actually after Jesus has died and been raised from the dead, and is much further down the road in James, the book of James. In James chapter 5, James has been talking to Christians here for the first 4 chapters. In the 5th chapter, it's very interesting that James kind of switches gears here, and he focuses for a moment on some wicked rich individuals who, they weren't wicked because they were rich, but they had fraudulently, held back funds from their laborers and such. They were wicked individuals. And so he pronounces some things against them and kind of warns them and tells them that there are miseries coming upon them. All right? And interestingly, this is very, very similar to what happened in the Old Testament when you look back at Samaria and you look back at the northern kingdom of Israel, how they were rich and wealthy and cared not for the word of God, and then God turned them over to the Assyrians. The Assyrians destroyed them and led them captive. But anyway, we have some similarities here. Here's some wicked, rich individuals. Now, in verse 7, he now turns his attention back to the Christians. And he says, "Therefore be patient, brethren." Well, they have to be patient because they're enduring some harsh things from some harsh individuals. "Therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." Now, he talks here again about the Lord coming, and he says, be patient, the coming of the Lord, until the coming of the Lord, And then at the end of verse 8, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Now, we see this phrase, at hand, a lot of times in the Scriptures. The kingdom of heaven was at hand. That was preached early on in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, the kingdom of heaven was at hand, meaning it was very close, very nearby. And the same idea is used here. The idea of at hand means you can almost reach out and touch it. It's right there at your fingertips.
Right.
Yeah, and so he's saying the coming of the Lord is at hand. So what's he talking about? Was Jesus physically going to return? Well, no, he's talking about the same things we're seeing here in Matthew chapter 24. When the temple's going to be destroyed and God is going to judge those wicked Jewish people. And I think you made mention last week, we're not against Jewish people or the Jews or anything. We're just talking about in the time the things that were happening in these events. And there clearly were a lot of wicked Jews. There were faithful Jews as well.
Yeah.
Apostle Paul, you mentioned, was one of those.
Their leaders were wicked and led the nation into rebellion against God. And that was the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
the leaders were definitely to blame there. But here in chapter 5, we see again his coming. So the point I wanted to make is that when we see the phrase, the Lord coming, or when is the time of your coming, it doesn't have to mean the end of the earth for you and I in that judgment day. It can refer to a different period of time that took place in the first century in which the Lord visited his people in judgment.
Okay, we'll talk more about that later, but you go ahead, if you will, please, in Matthew chapter 24, Trevor.
You sure you don't want to comment on that?
No, you go right ahead.
Okay. All right, well, going back to Matthew chapter 24, the second portion of that last question is after he says, what will be the sign of your coming, or they, excuse me, the apostles, what will be the sign of your coming in verse 3, Matthew 24:3, and the end of the age. Now, I made reference or mention a moment ago about the kingdom being taken from the Jews, the Israelite nation, and given to a nation bearing the fruits thereof. And I believe that's what he's talking about. I believe that was the end of an era there. And there's a couple of passages in Matthew chapter 24 that mention the end of something. You know, in Matthew chapter 24 in verse 6, he says, "And when you will hear of wars and rumors of wars," we'll get into this stuff more later, "but see that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Okay, so we see that phrase there. Also in verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." And I believe what he's talking about here is that end of the age. They had asked what's going to be the signs for the end of the age, and he's telling them what aren't the signs, basically, in the beginning here, and we'll get into that more later, I think. But there's going to be some things that took place, and Jesus is saying the end's not yet, but the gospel will be preached to all the world, and then after that, at a point after that, the end would come. And I believe he's still talking about in this time frame of this generation. In chapter 24 also, in verse 34, I'm kind of skipping around here, but just to understand the time frame, he says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So in their time period, he's talking to Peter, Andrew, James, and John. In these four men's time period, there would be an end of something. There would be an end of an era, and there would also be a coming of Jesus Christ. And we'll see later on, it's not going to be a physical coming. They're not going to see him in person, but he was going to come and visit them in judgment.
All right. Thanks very much, Trevor. We're running short of time, and so we're going to return to this when we have more time to talk about all of it. We'll pick up in our next study in Matthew chapter 24. And I hope that this is interesting to our audience. We're trying to present to you the scriptural reasons for why we're teaching what we're teaching. And we invite your questions. Trevor, again, remind them how to get in touch with you.
Sure. You can reach me by phone. It's 870-435-2737. And you'll see it out there on the screen, and our meeting times in Payette.
And you can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746. Email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write to me at Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. And if there's things that we've stated on here that you do not understand or that you disagree with, let us know. We'll respect that. We will keep you anonymous. We won't let people know who asks these questions, but we will deal with your question from the Bible itself on the air. Now, we have some things before us that we want to think about. The context of Matthew chapter 24, going all the way back, and of course we know the parallel passages in Mark 13 and in Luke chapter 21. And then we have the passages before this that set the context, and there's passages that follow it that complete the context, all of which we have to deal with in order to understand the overall question. But the question that we've been posing were concerning signs of the times. And so, Trevor, give them a sneak preview that hopefully will interest them in coming back to a further discussion of this. What are the signs of the times we should be looking for to know when Jesus is going to come in his second coming?
As far as I can see from the scriptures, there are none. Zero.
None whatsoever.
None.
All right.
Zero.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's not the answer you hear from most people, is it?
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
Most of them will say, "Oh, look at all the things going on." We know that Jesus is returning soon. And Trevor and I agree on this. No, I don't believe that you find that in the scriptures.
That's right.
So watch again next week, and we'll talk about this more. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.